neuroscience, quantum physics, biology, plant medicine, non-dual tantric meditative practices. We will be exploring these concepts with experts to provide insight. Get ready to melt reality with us.
Erik Dreff is a lecturer at Rutgers University whose research focuses on the concept of intellectual love of God in Spinoza primarily, with a view toward its medieval Jewish sources, as well as its influence on ethics, politics, religion, and metaphysics. Erik has a PhD from the University of Chicago Divinity School. He's published numerous papers on the history of religion, as well as on key figures in the Jewish tradition with a focus on Spinoza. Erik is currently in the process of working on the concept of time as an attribute of God, as well as the concept of love in post-rabbinic Jewish thought. Welcome to Exploring Reality, Erik.
Thanks for the introduction. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. So, Erik, you received your academic training from a school of divinity, and your CV is peppered with lots of interest in Judaism in many different contexts. So I'm always fascinated with academics who study major figures in Jewish philosophy and who study the history of Judaism in terms of their personal connection to the religion. And there are some, I'm sure there are some atheists who study these things, and I'm sure there are some devout, halakhic Jews who study these things. Can you tell us a little bit about your personal connection to Judaism?
Yeah, so how I ended up studying Judaism is an interesting story. When I applied to McGill University back in the day, they actually used to print out course books. And when they sent out the massive course book to my house, my mom actually got it first. And she earmarked the Judaism page and circled Intro to Jewish Thought. So amongst my many electives and all the other courses that I wanted to take was a single course on an introduction to Jewish thought, taught by Carlos Frankel. And from that point on, for the rest of my time at McGill, I took 2 courses per semester with him until I graduated. He ended up being my dissertation advisor, and I ended up doing work with him. And then at the end of my undergraduate experience, I came up to him and I asked him, where do I go to continue studying whatever this is? And he suggested the University of Chicago, where he knew someone from his grad school time who was working there. And he suggested Harvard. So I applied to both, got into both, but the University of Chicago gave me a better deal. So I went there.
So great. What about your connection then to the concept of God has moved you? Has your view of God changed to mean something different after years of exploration, including your studies of Spinoza?
Yeah, it's interesting because when I first came to McGill and I started studying it, I was just happy to be able to study Judaism, right? My parents are Russian immigrants, and they were just happy to be able to send their kid to actually study Judaism. And as I got more involved in it and I got to ask some of the questions, and my brain started to hurt at the confusing and answers that go all over the place, I came to enjoy the experience, right? Exercising the mind until it reaches its limits came to be enjoyable for me. And along that journey, I met Spinoza. He sounded more right than anyone else, so I kind of stuck with him. Would be the way I kind of explain it. As far as I understand, his picture of the world is promising, enticing, and adequately accurate for me.
So, all right, so let's jump off there. So I'm sure that most of our audience doesn't really know a whole lot about Spinoza. So tell us a little bit about Spinoza at a high level, why he's such an important figure in the history of, as I understand, in the history of philosophy, the history of Judaism, and the history of religion. What is it about him?
Spinoza holds an interesting position as the high watermark, or kind of the end of the medieval period and kind of the beginning of the modern period. In certain conversations, he's right at home in medieval philosophy. And in certain conversations, how dare you put him in that group? And he's absolutely a modern. He's right on that border. He's responsible for a lot of things us moderns take for granted, such as the separation of church and state, freedom of speech, and the liberal notion of religious tolerance. He argued most forcefully for these in the 17th century, and modernity has kind of taken those principles and run with them. But curiously, he argued for those principles from fundamentally theological medieval premises. And these things that us moderns take for granted were grounded in a very medieval worldview. And so that's my interest, right? How is it that we've managed to take the results of his work and not understand kind of the sources and what he's drawing on, right? And so that's kind of how I got to Spinoza.
Well, what would be the basic tenets then of philosophically of his work, and why does it matter in this day and age?
So I focused on the political things, right? That's why the West finds him interesting. But he's also perhaps the most thoroughgoing determinist in the history of philosophy. He does not believe in free will. There is no room for free will in his system. We have to operate with it, knowing it's an illusion just because that's a practical necessity of the way most humans work. But in reality, there's no such thing. I also find a lot of the things he says, such as he doesn't believe in miracles. He didn't believe in the Mosaic authorship of the Bible. He was a pantheist. A lot of these ideas have traction and purchase to a modern mindset. And those kind of things, they appeal to me, and the way he argues for them seems rather interesting. And then when you read the rest of the history of philosophy, Hegel, Marx, Nietzsche, all of these thinkers went through a Spinoza phase, and most of them never left it, if you really think about it. Even in Judaism, while Hermann Cohen and Buber, in their writings, you might see them say something negative about Spinoza. If you really follow what they're actually saying, they're actually a lot closer than they'd ever like you to think. He's always there. He was way ahead of his time, and so entirely too many fields have their godfather is Spinoza of their field. And so his position in terms of that history, that dividing line, and his kind of drawing in and accumulating all of that medieval and kind of transferring it as a kind of lens into the modern period, hugely important figure who doesn't get studied enough, right? He's operating at the same time as Descartes, and yet he completely disagrees with Descartes. His work, Leibniz and John Locke both really wanted to get their hands on his work. And Locke was vital to the writing of the Constitution of Virginia, which was then vital to writing the Constitution of the US. And so things like Benjamin Franklin's Bible that gets rid of all supernatural references. None of these things would be possible without Spinoza. So hugely important figure, Jewish of all things. And he's right there, sitting there waiting for people to study him and understand his role. So I figured I'd jump in on the fun and see what I could offer.
So how does then pantheism and atheism tie together?
Yeah, so if you look at the history of the use of the word atheism, it's rather interesting. Remember, Christians for the first 400 years were considered atheists. For too long, atheism just means you don't believe in my God, not you don't believe in a God. So yeah, Spinoza's name was synonymous with atheism for a good long while. That doesn't prevent other people from calling him a God-intoxicated philosopher, right? So there's he's a victim of both sides of the poles, of both poles of the extremes. But yeah, so while he doesn't accept Mosaic authorship and he doesn't believe in miracles and stuff like that, and he believes human reason is sufficient for morality and these types of things, at the time, he was called an atheist. I mean, he gets excommunicated from the Jewish community and he doesn't join another religion, right? This is wild. The fact that he has no desire to join another religion is completely wild.
So can you then talk about why he is then the archetype, the philosopher of love? Because love, when you're out of the intellect, is ecstatic. It's
Right.
more like a Sufi experience.
Right.
And I'm curious about how he became the philosopher of love.
Yeah. So for Spinoza, love is kind of the affectionate correlate to not just sound science, but good science. Often now, the question of good science might seem like an oxymoron, right? Science is supposed to be value neutral, right? E equals mc squared doesn't actually tell you anything about what to do with that knowledge. But we are humans, and when we practice science or we practice reason, we have certain interests and biases and hopes in mind. And when we have the betterment of humanity at its core, that produces a kind of love, right? It's an increase of power. When we see our fellow humans engaged in a like project, like rational minds committed to benefiting humanity, we experience a kind of heightened joy in that increase in our total power. And that heightened affect, that increased level of awareness that comes from being associated with like-minded humans, that's love when he understands it, right? That's love. You have a fundamental respect for the power of fellow rational humans.
I want to follow up a little bit on, I have a fascination with these terms and the distinction between some of these terms. We started in with pantheism, and the distinction between pantheism and panentheism.
Yeah.
As I understand it, Judaism is more consistent with panentheism than it is with pantheism, and maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah.
And then maybe segue to a concept that seems to me related. I'm not sure if it is to you, panpsychism, the notion of, consciousness throughout the universe, and maybe talk to us a little bit about the terms and how you think about them.
Sure. So pan, all, theism, God, right? Pantheism, all is God. Panentheism holds that everything that exists is still God, but that God doesn't exhaust the category of everything that is. There's still something a little extra outside the natural that God gets to include amongst his attributes. So it's kind of a way of allowing for pantheistic discussions or conceptions, but then still maintaining that supernatural, Ein Sof, mystical extra that the religious mind may want. Is it the most consistent position? Maybe not for Spinoza, right? I'm one of those people who tends to think that he is in fact a hard-line pantheist and there's nothing extra. But that doesn't stop people from reading panentheistic things or kind of learning from Spinoza how to talk about the pantheistic part, but then still believing or endorsing a panentheistic aspect of the divinity, right? So these types of things still have room. As for panpsychism, I think it's hard to use that word with Spinoza because Spinoza went really out of his way to include the material dimension of existence as part and parcel of God. When Spinoza speaks of the two attributes that we know of God, one of them is thought, that God thinks, that there is thought in the world, there are ideas. But the other one, and just as important and parallel with it, is the idea of extension, that God is extended, that existence exists, I'm sorry to use the same word again, in three dimensions and in physicality. And this must be recognized as a full infinite attribute of God. So it would be really hard to argue for panpsychism in a strictly Spinozistic sense. That's not to say the German idealists who were highly influenced by Spinoza didn't run and kind of develop a kind of version of panpsychism that can kind of stand on its own two legs. But Spinoza really is one of the people who really made a point to include the physical in his concept of reality. And so it'd be hard to argue for panpsychism.
It's fascinating. So in that case, Spinoza is considered a heretic in Orthodox Judaism, yet he's a devout Jew. And so I wondered if you could tell us why his views are considered heretical and what you think about those judgments.
Right. So the document of excommunication cites abominable opinions and deeds and heresies, right? But what those are, we don't quite know exactly. The best research says that it was, as I mentioned earlier, his lack of belief in the Mosaic authorship of the Bible, his lack of belief in miracles, and his biblical criticism, his approach to reading the Bible. That's one of the things. But, those ideas weren't fully fleshed out at the time of his excommunication, and there was nothing published for that. Another idea suggested by Stephen Nadler, the biographer of Spinoza, argues that at the time when Spinoza was being excommunicated, Manasseh ben Israel, the head of the Talmud Torah of Spinoza's congregation, was actually in, I believe it's Ireland, right, talking to Cromwell, trying to argue for admitting the Jews back in to England or Ireland, talking to Cromwell, right? So trying to get the Jews back in. And part of his argument was that, look, we can govern our own. You don't have to worry about us. If we have rebel rousers within our own community, we can deal with them. But at this exact time, Spinoza had like a financial dispute, and he actually went outside of the Jewish community to the Dutch authorities to help deal with it, which really made the Jewish community look bad, that they couldn't handle their own stuff. So it could have been that he went one step too far in terms of angering, one of the heads of his yeshiva, of his congregation. And it could have been some of his opinions. You know, he was the kid on Sunday school asking a few too many questions. They didn't quite like the look of it. And so they excommunicated him. But keep in mind, we have a letter from Spinoza that says, I'm glad they did it, because if I were to have initiated it, it would have caused a lot more controversy. He uses the word clamor, right? And so he was actually kind of thankful that he didn't have to go to services. He didn't have to listen to people saying things he didn't really agree with. He can just stay at home and, you know, grind lenses and talk philosophy with his few friends. That's kind of his approach, right? That's his excommunication. So yeah, he was, you know, he was deemed a heretic by the Orthodox, right? To say that the belief in miracles is completely wrong. I mean, Spinoza goes out of his way and says, he who believes in miracles desires that God not be God. Right? I mean, you say these types of things, you're going to anger some people.
You're gonna,
Yeah.
yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And even after he gets excommunicated, he makes no attempt to join any other Jewish congregation, Christian, Muslim, or otherwise. He joins no formal religion. And yet, at the end of his life, when he dies, we go into his works and we find that he's working on a book called the Hebrew Grammar. So the whole, he's an atheist, he wants nothing to do with Judaism, he thinks it's complete garbage and nonsense, the Bible's absolute hogwash. What is he doing writing a Hebrew grammar if none of that matters?
It's
You can't
fascinating.
argue that. So
It's
this whole, what category do we place him in? He's the perfect example of this, because none of the categories work. None of them.
that's amazing.
Yeah, so
Let's
right, so
Yeah, let's segue to another sort of character who's very hard to, you know, to pigeonhole in this light, rationalist, scientist, scientific thinker, analytical thinker, Maimonides, who lived, you
yeah,
know,
right.
hundreds of years before Spinoza. So on the one hand, Maimonides codified the Jewish perspective on devotion to God in his 13 principles, as I understand it. And on the other hand, he was considered heretical in his own time, because his notion that pursuing scientific knowledge was even above pursuing Torah,
Right.
which, you know, and he lauded the Aristotelians and the Greeks, and, you know, he had a great sort of appreciation for science, for science. So how do you harmonize those sort of seemingly contradictory
So it's
views?
curious that you mentioned the Mishneh Torah and you mentioned the 13 principles, but the Mishneh Torah itself has several kind of preface introductions to its various parts. Those introductions are steeped with philosophical intonations and suggestions, and even the first principle, right? I mean, the opening of the Mishneh Torah, right, is Yesadeh Yesadot Ve'amud Hachamot Le'dah Sheyesham Matsuri Rishon. The pillar of the sciences and the foundation of foundations is to know that there is a first existent. So the Mishneh Torah starts with a command to know philosophically that there is a first existent, not a God who was involved in history, who took us out of Egypt and gave us the 10 commandments. No, a first existent, a first mover, an Aristotelian concept at its core. So in order to be a good Jew and to do all the rest of the 13, the first one is that you have to be a decent Aristotelian.
It's really
absolutely
wild.
that he puts this out there. So if you see that part of the Mishneh Torah and you're able to see that in that text, then you know what he's trying to do in the Guide of the Perplexed, or you know, in the parable of the palace in Guide 351, where he talks about getting closer to the ruler in the palace.
Right.
The usual metaphor where he talks about, you know, someone who understands the law but doesn't go into the principles of the law, or doesn't go even further than that, is outside the palace. They're not really all the way in. Right. And so you can see how he's trying, because he's a communal leader. He sees what's going on in the Muslim world. He understands what's going on in the Christian world. And these ghettoized Jews reading the Talmud are just, they're not going to cut it. He needs people to get involved in the rest of the rational project, the rest of the human civilization project. And so he writes his book, you know, in Judeo-Arabic, to get people more involved in the lingua franca at the time, in the language of commerce at the time. He gets philosophy tucked in, all these little secrets and codes and messages all over throughout his texts. He's, you know, leading the people to water bit by bit, if you will.
It's incredible in the 10th century.
Yeah, and 12.
Okay.
Right, and so you can see Spinoza really picks up this trail, and he goes right to the logical end. You know, he goes all the way to the deep end and then further, and presents what happens if we go all the way to the end. And there's a way to understand the response to Spinoza, right? The modern response of all these nation states is just trying to figure out how Spinozistic can we be and how do we get there without losing our entire power structure.
So, all right. So that's a great segue. We've been delving into the scientific aspect of great Jewish thinkers and how they sort of emphasize science and Aristotelian analytics and logic. So now let's sort of segue to meaning, right? So the great Rabbi Jonathan Sacks has described the harmony between science and religion. He said that science is really about understanding how the universe works, but religion is about finding meaning. So I think everybody really understands what science is about and the definition of science. Talk to us a little bit about your view on how religion helps us find meaning in the universe.
Yeah, I've heard it referred to as kind of the God of the gaps, right? If we accept science's own claims to not deal with questions of why, but simply tell us the what and the how, right? Then the human desire to question things and understand is incomplete, right? Then science has admitted that it cannot be the only thing we use to answer questions. So what do we do when we want to know why, right? Or let alone the value of things. Is E equals MC squared a good thing, right? Is nuclear power a good thing? Well, if you go to a hurricane-stricken Puerto Rico and install a nuclear power there, that's a good thing, right? In 1945, nuclear power had a very different understanding. Right. And so the question of values is notoriously an extremely tricky one. We still don't have a set definition of what the good is. And I think it's when we update our understanding of the world scientifically, but then we're faced with the questions of value, of absolute concern, of what is beyond the scientific understanding we currently have. We need to refer to existing traditions and the experience of our ancestors. And I think that's where religion or Judaism comes in.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, now science, of course, they're having to grapple with the why, with the whole exploration that actually reality is made up of consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a whole disruptive, innovative conversation when they come down to the quantum level that, well, actually, life is made up of a living, vibrating, energetic, empty potentiality.
Right.
And so all of a sudden, the what and the how is like, well, why are we made of, what is this? What is this? So it's very disruptive. And so, with these concepts, this grappling between science and religion, would you be able to talk to our listeners about, from your personal perspective, about your own exploration of quote unquote God that could be considered more experiential, like in the way I mentioned, Sufi dancers experiment and explored ecstasy by moving out of their intellect, or the way non-dual tantric mystics feel the thing of life's spark.
Yeah, well, without going too much into my experimentation with hallucinogenics back in high school, I can at least say that young me certainly experienced a meaning beyond the merely phenomenal. There was always something a little bit behind the order that I wanted to ask questions about and kind of understand. As I started studying Spinoza, I started to realize that this supposed gap between what I see and what's behind it doesn't need to be as big as I once imagined it, right? And then as I continued more and more, I ended up finding that the control, right? The self-awareness and understanding larger and larger causal chains and being able to put those together to explain why this is happening, why I'm feeling this, is really empowering, really, really empowering. And really strengthening in an existential and in an emotional and mental faculty, right? It really helps hone the soul, if you will. And so I found certain benefits of, in times of crisis, familial angst, this, that, confusion. Spinoza has been extremely helpful for me. And he's really given me the adequate tools to understand my place. I might be wrong in the end of it, who knows, right? But thus far, it's working, right? So far, his model has proved excellent results. And that's just happened from seeing things, reacting, reflecting, and then applying what I know or what I understand from Spinoza or Jewish thought or the history of philosophy. And that kind of making sense of things and kind of giving me the power to understand where I am and to recognize when I've been overcome, when I've been completely overdetermined, when I've been completely put at sea. This is empowering. You know, back in the day when they used to do poster sales for the first year students at universities, I always used to love that poster that shows billions of stars, right? And there's that small arrow that says, "You are here," right? You can take that to be both incredibly humbling and incredibly alarming, right? You can be like, holy smokes, I am now responsible for this entire picture, right? This blue dot is the only thing we know of with any kind of awareness. And this is now responsible for everything, right? That's quite the responsibility. That's almost a divine kind of responsibility. And that's a little much. That can be daunting. But the idea that, you know, just worry about what's in your purview, right? You're not about to move the stars. You're not about to shift the axis of Jupiter, right? What you can do is make a few people smile a little more often, you know, make a few people a little happier. And boy, oh boy, is that a lot. Not only is that enough, that's a lot.
So is
and
this
kind of recognizing that and to do God's work in that vein, that's good for me.
so is this your concept of humility that you wrote in a recent blog post on the importance of humility? Is that kind of what you're talking about
Yeah.
now?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I take it, you know, like don't try and take responsibility for the whole map. That's wild. Right? That's a long-term infinite project. You are delightfully finite. And so just own it and just kind of study your own place because we're never going to get there unless you do your thing. You know, everyone has to do their thing in the large scheme of things for the whole project to eventually get there.
Let's talk about a concept that we've touched upon, but I don't think we've sort of hit on the head, and that's the concept of morality. So I have a very strong interest in the roots of morality and the basis to moral systems in the context of religion and in the context of philosophy. So I guess let me just ask you a broad question. Do you believe in a universal absolute morality, or are you of the view that morality is more relativistic? And talk a little bit about
So
that.
I would like to say that there is an absolute. I think the relativistic approach is dangerous, specifically to reason and to the scientific project at large. I understand the kind of misplaced defensiveness on how you might not want to say bad things about that group over there, and that kind of prevents us from doing that. But no, I believe in the rational project, and I believe we can understand what, to a degree, things are good. Now, do I believe that that good comes from outside the natural system? Maybe not, right? I like statistics. All right. I like data and I like using that. So if you have an idea that the such and such is good for your people, show me the data, right? Like abstinence only education, right? The people who endorsed that were gravely mistaken. The data proved completely contrary to their intent. Abstinence did not lead to less, you know, teen pregnancies. The worst thing possible. So in that sense, I believe if you want a certain thing, then there are objective things that we can do to attain it. Am I at a position to think that we're anywhere close to having some sort of absolute list? No. Do I think at this point we have at least a couple of general objective truths amongst us? Yes. Right? Human life has value outside of what it produces, right? There's something integral to a human life. This we can agree on, right? But then when you start getting on questions like, is water a right? This we have to, right? This is a debate, right? This is still something that needs to be touched on. And I would like to say that we can eventually get to a position where we can argue that it's an objective fact that certain things that are necessary for life are a right. But that, you know, work has yet to be done, right? But in no way would I be willing to sign my membership card for the relativist camp. I'll put it that way.
It's very interesting. Well, yeah, that we always ask our guests about their view on the ego. Of course, exploring reality maybe is this question of who are we? Like,
Yeah.
how do we define the I in the world?
Yeah.
How do we define the ego, and what do we have to say? How do you define the ego, and what do you have to say about its importance in both your pursuit of Judaism and science?
Yeah, so I'm going to bring in a little known part of Spinoza's philosophy, and it's not usually discussed very much, but for Spinoza, to be is to have an effect, right? So to the extent that Aristotle got mentioned today, and there may have been an effect as a result of his mentioning, Aristotle has being even now. His body is long gone, but he's still alive in a way. He's still influencing undergrads all over the place. So the border between who I am and who Aristotle is a little blurry. Because Aristotle and I combine every time I walk into class to have a certain effect on my students. And for Spinoza, there's a very legitimate way how, you could draw a circle that included Aristotle and included me, and you can say this is one entity. And this one entity had the effect of influencing these students to learn this and this, in September of 2024. So notions of the ego really depends on what's the result of that ego? What's the result of that identity? What is the result of this conglomeration of modes? And what did it produce? What's its practical effect, right? What did it force itself on? What did it impinge on? What did it bounce off of, right? What ideas did it produce in other people? And so that's kind of my understanding of self. So I contribute my personal energies to larger and larger systematic forces, political forces, religious forces, right? Socio-political forces, you name it. And so I think in that sense, to be aware of yourself and to more consciously enjoy when one gets to be involved with larger and larger systems, I think that's where the ego comes in. I think that's kind of enjoy the ride you're on.
That's great. That's really great. All right. Well, I have one more question for you. So following up, I think it really sort of flows right from that concept. You asked a very provocative question in this post that I've been referring to. What is a human? What a provocative question, and it's really interests both Jody and me. So give us your thoughts. Close us out by giving us your thoughts on that important question. I know it's not a small question, and how it might or might not relate to the concept of the ego.
Oh, yeah. So it's interesting. So I think it definitely relates to the concept of the ego. I think the ego is simply an individualized instance of the human, right? If one were to take the sum total of egos, one would come up with the sum total of the human species, if one were ever able to do that. So what is a human? I think you'd kind of, I'd borrow from A Beautiful Mind, right? It's a bunch of egos, each following their own interests. According to Spinoza, each finite mode endeavors to persevere in its own being, right? That's what it is to be. It's to try to continue being. And so what is a human is a group of things that look something like us, trying to continue looking like us and being like us and understanding its own place and directing that and enjoying the ride that the human species is on, right? We're on a rock twirling around a ball of hydrogen, twirling around a black hole at God knows how many miles an hour in the middle of a vast vacuum, right? So at a certain point, once we become fully aware of our situation, we're going to be able to kind of give us a certain power to determine where we go from there. And at that point, we're going to have to, I think the degree to which we incorporate the existing egos and consider all egos when we come to that decision, I think will be a good standard, a good judgment of who we are across the cosmos, right? When it comes down to if we ever meet anybody else that has agency, I think that'll be a good barometer for comparison at that point.
Wonderful. Wow, it's been very, very interesting. We touched on a lot of topics. It was a little rapid fire, but I want to thank you so much for agreeing to spend some time with us.
My pleasure. Anytime.
All right. Thank you, Erik.
Thank you so much. Thank
Not
you.
really. Anytime. It was really fun. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
This episode was brought to life by Ka Pathogenics, offering 100% plant-based supplements featuring Kana, a South African plant that's clinically proven to reduce stress, lift mood, and improve focus, helping you feel more alive, energized, and connected while also supporting your immune and nervous systems. Kana is safe, legal, non-addictive, and life-changing. Try Kakana Chews or Tincture to feel calm and alive from head to heart. Go to ohmyka.com and get 10% off with code REALITYMAYBE at checkout. That's ohmyka.com.
Exploring Reality Maybe is written, produced, fact-checked, and edited by Jody R. Weiss and David Schwartz. Research support is provided by Semicolon Connects. Music produced by Nextbox. Visit our website at exploringrealitymaybe.org to find show notes, transcripts, bios, and to learn more. If you like the show, please visit our website to donate.